Hi, and welcome to another episode of the Leadership Untitled Podcast with me, Rob Moores, the show that likes to give out loads of information and advice to HR, L&D, operational leaders to help them become better leaders and hopefully thrive in what we like to call a coaching culture. Now, my guest this week is a really special guest in the world of coaching and is going to help you to do that instantly. Professor David Clutterbuck. Now, there's a good chance that if you've done any CIPD courses or coaching qualifications, you may well have stumbled across a book or two of his. He's written or co-written around about 80 on the subject, so I would say quite the authority. And in his own words, he's the last fully active survivor of the pioneers of coaching and mentoring. He's also special ambassador to the oldest professional association in the field. That's the EMCC, which he also co-founded. So please join me in welcoming David to the podcast. Hi David, welcome to the Leadership Untitled Podcast. How are you today?
I'm brilliant, yes. Yeah. It's the end of the day. I've had a very good day and I'm enjoying myself.
A very good day. What's been today?
Oh, lots of interesting conversations with people around virtual reality and coaching.
Virtual reality.
Yes, so that's something I'm passionate about. And some really good supervision sessions this morning with really experienced and insightful coaches bringing fascinating cases for analysis.
Excellent stuff. I mean, I don't think you can beat a conversation as far as that getting a load of insight from, and just that's where the magic happens, isn't it? So I'd like to say at this point on the episode is why it is I've invited people. Now, it may be that my listeners will probably have a fair guess at who you are and why I've possibly invited you. But obviously through my studies, so where it's been my CIPD diploma, whether it's been my coaching, the supervision you mentioned, I'm currently going through my supervision course with the ICCS, and obviously from an EMCC perspective, accredited through them. So it would be fair to say that your name has cropped up on more than one occasion, whether that's on the front cover of a book or a website or whatever it might be. And one of the things I'm massively passionate about, if not most passionate about, is the ability and time for leaders to have not only their own coaching, but to coach their teams. And there's a massive gap in that I find in organizations, which I'm sure we'll get into. But I guess first of all, I guess more of a background, what I'm really interested in to start with, how did you first get into this coaching mindset? Well, how did you first get bitten by the bug as one of the founding pioneers, I suppose, of the movement?
Well, I was a young, but I was a management journalist. Young seems a long way away there now. I ended up editor of a journal that no longer exists called International Management, run by McGraw-Hill. And in that role, I interviewed lots of people about good practice in management. And one of the academics I interviewed in the States was a lady called Kathy Cram, who'd done her PhD study on mentoring.
Yep.
And there were some real issues about that in terms of whether it really was mentoring or something else she was measuring. But nonetheless, it got me interested in this whole idea of the learning dialogue between two people, and that inevitably led to writing the first book on mentoring programs back in 1985. It's had 5 editions, and I know I should do another one, but it's finally time to do it. And at that stage, nobody really talked about coaching. Business coaching didn't exist back in the early 1980s. Back then we got to 1991, and I found a marvelous academic called David Megginson, who became a great friend. He's no longer with us, but he and I said, well, let's bring together a network of people who want to do research in this area, to want to develop good practice and so forth. And that's where the EMC, the European Mentoring Centre, which then became EMCC, originated in Sheffield University. It became EMCC because we found there were a lot of people out there who were doing pretty much what mentors were doing, but charging money for it.
Okay.
and calling themselves coaches. And so we said, well, there's more commonality here than there is difference. And that's why the EMCC came about, because it brought together the coaches and mentors in one community, and increase. And the perspective on this, of course, is that that mentors have all the skills of a coach, but they're not they're not so fixated on the process. They're focused much more on the conversation. Now, we found actually in the work of the coach maturity research group that actually the more mature coaches get, the more that they become more like mentors and less like and less focused on process. It's about the presence and all the rest of it. And so one of the lovely definitions is that mentoring is coaching plus. So it's behaving like a coach, asking those powerful questions, but being able to draw on your wisdom, your knowledge, your experience to craft better questions from the inside, to empathize more, and where appropriate, offer some specific context. And I think this is one of the big areas where we get so much confusion. People confuse context and advice. Now, neither coaches nor mentors, if they're doing the job properly, give advice except in extreme circumstances. Now, there are times when you're going to say, well, you're going to go to jail if you do that. It would be inappropriate not to say, not to comment, to make that comment. But when you give somebody context, you're giving them a piece of information they wouldn't be able to access on their own, that enhances the quality of their thinking. When you give somebody advice, you're doing the thinking for them. And so the overlap between mentoring and coaching is relatively small, but so it's this giving context that mentors sometimes do, and also they're much more likely to be a role model. But those are the two critical differences that we've been able to identify, and the two roles go together. And what we found in the coach maturity research group is where we've interviewed lots of very experienced coaches about their learning journey. And the reality is they use more and more of themselves. They become more like mentors. They mix the two roles far more as they become more confident in their own ability.
Yeah, it's really interesting, because I think one of the things that attracted me to EMCC when I was looking at the different bodies was that amalgamation of mentoring and coaching together, which for so long and in so many coaching programs, training programs, it's the stock exercise to kind of go, what's the difference between a mentor and a coach? And it's very much divided into two, and the two shall never come together. And I often felt like I was getting a bit of an identity crisis, going, well, sometimes I feel like maybe I'm stepping into that. Should I not be stepping into that? And I think, even more so in the supervision world now that I'm looking into as well, which is fascinating in its own right. Because I think, you'd asked me 12 months ago, I'd have said supervision was either observing me or coaching the coach. But there's so much more to it again. And again, far more potentially on that prescriptive side of it.
Yeah. Somebody to question you if you're are you being ethical? Yeah. And that's important. It's part of the supervisor's role. It's interesting to see this notion that coaches, the mentors give advice and coaches don't. It comes from the United States, and it was primarily a defense mechanism by coaches who wanted to try and put some clear water between them earning money from what they did and mentors who didn't.
Okay, I like that.
It's entirely spurious distinction, and a bit of negative marketing, if you like.
I sense there could be a title for the episode in that somewhere. We'll come back to that later on. I quite like that. But I find it fascinating, and also I think probably kind of service-led coaches have found along the lines that their clients, their coachees, they occasionally do need that little bit more than just the open question, shall we say. They do want a bit more of that expertise, and I guess it varies up and down the chain as well. Different people require different things in any one moment from the coach or mentor that's in front of them.
Yeah, I mean, how do you know what you don't know? And just being able to point somebody towards a body of knowledge or a perspective they don't have is really important in helping them to grow and to tackle their issues and define their own solutions there to the issues that they bring. In a supervision session I was doing this morning, we one of the things that inevitably came up, we were talking about different issue cases that people brought, and as a supervisor, I'm able to say, well, this could, are you familiar with Schneider's hope theory? Was one thing. And we said, well, no. So we said, well, okay, well, let's look at this in the context of the case here. Now, how does that, how does does that theory actually help? Does it help you to see it differently? And it did. And so what we've done here, there is to point people towards a source of knowledge they can go and dig much more deeply into and explore if they want to. But I'm not telling them you should do this. I'm simply giving them a different way of thinking about it.
Definitely. And that's far more important than just this kind of race to get to a result or a solution that we often find is the case, that you can't, I guess, if you're overly process driven.
Yeah, well, if you're looking for a solution, it's the coach's need to find a solution, or the coach's need for the client to have a goal. It's not the client's many times.
Why do you feel that coaches often do that?
Well, I think because they've been taught process. With this, and the problem with that in the current world is that if you are a coach that works according to a process, AI can already do it better than you can. So what is the point of you being there?
That's a really interesting point. I mean, I was on an AI call yesterday, part of the Learning Performance Institute team. And it's just limitless. And you're absolutely right. You can hold a relatively human-like conversation now. Some would argue a more human-like conversation than you can with certain people.
But we're looking at the moment at taking all my vast library, the stuff that I've written, because it's all most of my books are digital. Some of them are too old to be digital. But basically, we're going to take the books, the hundreds and hundreds of articles and blogs and all that kind of stuff, put them into an AI. And basically, people will be able to use it as a chatbot to be able to ask questions and get hopefully some sensible answers out of it. That's this stuff is now.
And it's really exciting because the true nature of it gives access to more people to a coaching conversation, which is what it's all about at the end of the day.
Yeah, well, we give it a couple of years. This interview will be done by my deep fake.
Deep fake. Maybe I am a deep fake. I don't know whether anyone would want to deep fake Rob Moores, but I doubt it very much. So I kind of like bring it into this world of leadership. Now, I'm bought into it. As far as I'm concerned, all leaders should be coaching and all leaders should be getting coaching. There could be mixes from coaching internally, and there could be professional coaches, accredited coaches coming in and doing it as well. But so often I find that it isn't done. Now, what are the reasons? Well, I guess first of all, let me rewind from that. Do you find the same? And if so, what are the reasons that you often find for it not being done as often or as well as it could be?
We're seeing a significant shift in the concept of what makes a great leader. And we identified 4 characteristics. It's compassion, courage, curiosity, and connectedness. And these 4 characteristics seem to, from the modern literature, seem to underpin all the studies that have been done around. When people talk about a really great leader, what did they see in that person? And so if we're going to develop those qualities, it shifts the nature of the leader role towards more of a curator. And I tend to avoid talking about the leader as coach, because A, it gets people's hackles up, and B, it's actually too confining. The idea that the leader is somehow superior to everybody else, and in every I've got superior authority, therefore I must be a better coach than you are. Yeah, that sort of goes against the grain. In reality, the role of the leader is to create the conditions where coaching can happen rather than to impose it on people. And
Mm-hmm.
so sometimes they may come to the leader to be coached, or they may ask for coaching outside, or they may coach each other.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes even the leader can be coached by the team. One of the things I love doing, it's a brilliant exercise, I think, is with their permission, I will coach a leader in front of their team.
Wow.
And then we'll step back and the leader will invite one or more members of the team to carry on the coaching conversation with them, to be coached by their team. Now, that requires courage.
Yeah.
They encourage all of those four characteristics I just mentioned.
Mm.
But this, I think, this is where the leader role it needs to happen. It's a struggle.
Mm.
In a study that I did last year for the conference board, we did focus groups with lots of uh, very senior HR leaders across Europe, and the one of the key themes that came out of this was that for many of these organizations, a significant proportion of their top 200 or 300 they perceived to be obsolete.
Okay.
And these obsolete leaders had two characteristics in common. One was that they couldn't think systemically.
Mm-hmm.
And the other was they wanted to cling on to being the person in charge, to control.
Yeah.
Um, and in the modern environment, that doesn't work. All they end up doing is taking more and more things back onto their own shoulders and achieving less.
Mm. And there's
And
something in that about that. How do I prove I am worthy of this role that hierarchically is above that team or
yeah,
group?
yeah. Um, and imposter syndrome is rife
Mm.
at this level. So we've got a number of theoretical constructs. We call them both business evolving as usual teams, where the team leader doesn't even do appraisals.
Yeah.
Um, so instead, everybody takes responsibility and ownership of their own developmental plan. And so every 6 weeks or 2 months or whatever, but at regular intervals, they go round their stakeholders inside the team and out, and they ask for feedback and they ask for suggestions around learning objectives. So they then come to the team leader
Mm-hmm.
to coach them through how they through that development plan that they've created, to challenge them on it.
Mm.
Yeah, but it's about helping them take responsibility and then helping them deliver that responsibility. Now, you're going to get some people who abuse the system, who basically where you do have to come heavy as in the disciplinary role,
Mm-hmm.
and that's inevitable. But for most people, they will rise to that challenge. They
Mm.
don't really, everybody hates appraisals. All the research on appraisals show that nobody enjoys them. They actually don't do anything to improve performance.
Yeah.
They're totally pointless. But here we're looking at somebody saying, okay, now what am I going to achieve over the next 6 or 8 weeks?
Mm.
What help do I need from my manager, and what help do I need from my colleagues?
Mm.
Uh, and all of this goes together into a team development plan where people look at how they're going to develop together
Mm.
rather than focusing it on the individual. So there's a lot that can be done in what we call BOW teams, business evolving as usual,
Mm.
that enables the leader to really take this role of as coach and enhance it to being into the role of curator.
Mm. Yeah, I'm loving that idea, because what I'm hearing there is it's this, rather than throwing accountability onto people to do something, to get a result or to achieve a goal or whatever it might be, we're actually helping to inspire and foster some responsibility within them, their
Yeah.
own feeling of responsibility, which in my experience then tends to lead to a self feeling of accountability to deliver it. You don't need to push that accountability anymore. It kind of grows inside.
And enables them to grow into leaders too.
Yeah, absolutely. So what's the pushback to this? Have you encountered
Oh,
pushback to these ways of working?
the children you put it. Well, that's one step too far for us. There's
Yeah.
the common thing I hear. Now we'd have trouble getting that past HR, or we'd have trouble getting that past the CEO. Um, and my response to that is, look, go and experiment with it.
Yeah.
Try to find the soft spot where people can do this to demonstrate, to show what can be done.
I think that's crucial. That kind of that experimentation.
Yeah.
Definitely. I think this is one of the exercises I run with a lot of leaders in workshops, and I almost describe it as a dragon's den kind of moment to go, you know what, when you pitch a great idea it's to the C-suite, to the CEO, whoever it might be, to the head of HR, and it is around having time to have more conversations, more thinking time, more self responsibility. All these things will sound great, but how do we tie that into something that's going to make that C-suite member, that CEO go, okay, I'm in, I get it. I'm willing to invest, as Theo Paphitis used to say, my children's inheritance into this idea because I can see some sort of return. And in coaching, so often I will hear, and I've met so many senior leaders who've said it or words to this effect, just go, so, well, why am I going to be paying people to just sit down and talk to each other all the time when they should be working?
Yeah.
Where'd you go with that one, David?
Oh, one of my favorite exercises is to get leaders split them up into twos to coach
Mhm.
each other. And I say, right, so here's the scenario. You've just been called up to the CEO's office. I said, right, want you to be part of a really important bet the company project team that's going to start work in 3 months' time. Now, we can't release you from your current job. You're going to have to be, you're going to stay on your current job. So you've got to it's going to take 80% of your time. So you've got to do your job in 20% of the time. You can't work any extra hours because then you'll be inefficient. So you've got 3 months to plan this. How are you going to do it? We sit them down to coach each other. And it's hilarious because when it starts off saying, totally impossible, except occasionally we get somebody who says, well, I'm in that situation now. But they guide it. I think without exception, everybody after half an hour or so manages to identify ways of reducing their workload,
Mhm.
stopping doing things that should be done by other people by 40% or more.
Wow. So even more than they needed to do. And it's one of those things, isn't it? You will often you will hear everybody, so many people always talking about how busy they are and the kind of prioritization that needs to take place. But equally, you also hear a lot of people talk about the needless things that happen every day at work, or the meetings they wish they didn't need to be part of, or maybe I only needed to be at 20 minutes of that one.
Yeah. So it just gives them a different perspective. That's what coaching does. It enables people to see things differently, and it creates clarity.
Hmm. So in your experience then, and I guess you'll have a million of these stories, but if you're for those listeners out there, those I guess who are probably looking at certain middle managers, we're looking at L&D directors and HR directors that are really trying to sell this coaching culture vision to the
Mm.
C-suite and the CEO, and maybe they're just keep getting knocked back. What sort of advice could you give them? What sort of route or method might they start to adopt?
Well, yeah, all of these things start at the top in the sense that if you've got buying from the top, then you get the resources to be able to do things.
Hmm.
Um, um, and so that's one starting place. There are others which I'll come to, but if you start with the top, so what's what is what is the CEO or what are the guys on the top, at the top team doing to exemplify and role model coaching behaviors?
Hmm.
Um, and one of the tasks I love is to be there, observing a CEO attempting to do some coaching, and then giving feedback to both him or her and the coachee
Hmm.
as a learning environment. So building the habit of thinking in a coaching mindset. So that's from above, but from below, we've got all sorts of interest groups, particularly in the context of diversity and inclusion. And so engaging them
Hmm.
with the process as well to get pressure out of those. So one of the areas we're experimenting with quite substantially now, and it's fascinating, we call it reciprocal mentoring. And
Hmm.
what's happening here? We've had reverse mentoring for a long time. Or you put somebody senior and somebody junior together, and the junior person educates the more senior person, who's usually from the majority ethnic group, about what life is like for people down below.
Yeah.
And the benefit to the more junior person is they get to understand the system and how to work the system. And so the problem with this is that then actually undermines a lot of the work for D&I, for diversity and inclusion, because people see that this person who's learned to work the system advances,
Hmm.
and they think, well, look, he did okay, or she did okay. Yeah,
Yeah.
so everything's all right then, isn't it? And so they don't address the fundamental issues that are underneath, the systemic issues that prevent D&I.
Mm.
So what we're doing is creating relationships where a partnership of co-learners, one from above, one from below, not only work together to understand each other's world, but also to identify barriers that they can see that create the negative outcomes that impair equal rights and fairness.
Hmm.
Um, and so by identifying these things, now you bring the cohorts together. So you've got maybe 10 top people from the top management and 10 people from down below.
Hmm.
And you could start to look at the system as a whole and say, how do we deal with that system? Yeah. How do you, and because you're hitting it from above and below, you've got much greater chance of changing the system.
Mm.
That's the theory. We're still working through with the experimental companies and organizations at the moment. But I'm thrilled with it. I think it's a way in which coaching and mentoring could just make a hell of a difference.
Absolutely. I mean, on a completely different scale, but I run workshops where similarly we'll bring those kind of dynamics together, and so much comes out of them. And never in the world called it reciprocal mentoring, or it hasn't gone as far as I'm sure you're going with it. But just bringing people together to talk and understand, I think, is the key. Let me listen to you and understand what's going on in your worlds. I mean, if we put our CEO hat on for a second, and kind of we're in that C-suite now, so we're at the other side of the table. We've got the L&D director or the HR director coming into us now. And I remember speaking a while ago to Stephen M.R. Covey, and he talks about trust, and he just said, think about relationships where trust is high and trust is low, and I'll guarantee that those relationships where trust is high, things happen quicker and they cost less. And show me a CEO who doesn't want things to happen quicker and cost less. And I thought, well, you know what? There's some fundamental words there that are going to get them latched onto that. So if we do that with coaching, what is it that's going to get a CEO excited about the prospect of not just rolling out some coaching, but actually going on the mission to create a culture of coaching and reciprocal mentoring and all the things you're talking about? What sort of things is actually going to drive them to go, that is now a priority for me?
Well, I like the analogy of the fulcrum and how you get things done.
Mhm.
You try and push a big rock, and you're here. It doesn't matter where you stand on that rock, you're not going to be able to move it.
Yeah.
But if you've got loads of people or you're creating, moving it beside you and from different directions, it's going to move.
Mm.
And the idea that the leader is hero is just obsolete. Yeah. Um, uh, in many in so many ways, the leader. Well, be absolutely practical. When we talk, when I've been doing quite a lot of work asking teams how they feel about their ability to influence the organization.
Mm.
What's what's fascinated me is it doesn't matter where in the organization the team is, the majority of them say they feel victims of the system, not influencers of the system, including the top team.
Okay, interesting.
Okay, yeah, and that is fascinating. So, what's happening here? We have an epidemic of powerlessness. So how do we actually release the energy in the organization? How do we make, how do we actually have the ideas, the vision that we have for the organization? How do we empower people to make that happen instead of getting in the way?
That's interesting, because what kind of a subtext of what I've heard there, and correct me if I'm wrong, there's also there's almost a sometimes the problem that needs to be addressed can't be seen. And by starting to have conversations, again, not always does that then come out, but through maybe asking some really pertinent and sometimes obvious questions that we never have the courage or the vulnerability to ask, and because we don't want the answers. But if we manage to get those, maybe anonymously, and that starts to throw some data up at us that will start to get us interested in going, wow. For example, I didn't know that one survey that I do tends to be around trust. So I'll go, I didn't know that only 25% of people in the organization trust their line manager. That can't be good.
No.
What can we do about that?
And even less will trust top management.
Yeah, I see that sort of staggers as you go up. Absolutely. Some people don't trust themselves. That's the nature of the beast, but it tends to be higher than it is up the chain. Yeah.
Yeah, it's well. I mean, it's you might want to cut. We may have to cut this, but there is the analogy of the panda tree.
Mm-hmm.
You know this one?
No.
Oh, that's it's the vision of the organization. Imagine a tree full of a great big tree, eucalyptus, full of pandas,
Yeah.
and the youngest, freshest leaves are at the top, and right up there is Daddy Panda munching away.
Yeah.
And Daddy Panda looks down, and all the other pandas look up at him. Um, and of course, all Daddy Panda sees is smiley faces. Yeah.
Yeah.
But look at it from the other direction, from the pandas right at the bottom of the tree. They look up, and what do they see?
Yeah, I can imagine what you say. Yes. Yeah.
And it is a beautiful analogy of so many organizations, particularly the fear-ridden organizations. And we can, well, hang on a minute. How do we change that? How do we um, distribute power in the organization? How do we get, how do we allow everybody to be able to see the horizon? These are fundamental questions that I think now that we need to address as leadership. Leadership is not about taking charge. In fact, in some studies we did quite a lot of work here. What are the functions of leaders? And what we basically found was there were only two functions of a leader that can't be distributed. One of those is getting authority from above, and the other one is protecting the team, the team from interference from outside. Everything else, from appraisals all the way through to strategy to vision, that they can all be distributed to a greater or lesser extent within the team. So what's the point? So the role of leader needs to be radically reevaluated. And if we go all the way up and go beyond the executive team and look at the board, the concept of the board goes back to, well, we hear boards, in fact, the word board being used, 1,200 years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's in fact, but the word board is a table, as in bed and board.
Yeah.
And those times the board was made up of because they didn't have the tools that we had. They were made up of short, thick planks, and I'm not going to comment upon that in terms of. But it's a concept where the king sat at one end in the chair on the throne, and the people, the rest of the people on the board sat along on benches alongside it. So hence the design of Parliament. This is and the power all rested in the king, of course. So we've sort of refined this model over the centuries, but essentially this is a medieval, pre-medieval model.
Mm,
So what is in an environment where everything keeps moving and changing rapidly, um, and the board only meets once every month or sometimes once every 3 months,
mm.
what's the point? What are they there for? Um,
Yeah.
and increasingly, we're beginning to question, do we need to replace the board with something completely different? If we want, what decision can we actually recreate this so that the critical decisions are made in a timely manner at the place where they're most needed, which is on the edges of the organization in the middle, very often. Um,
Mm,
so rethinking organizations in this way, I think is a very interesting challenge for leaders.
absolutely. Something you said before as well, it really sort of piqued my interest because it's this idea of um, getting everyone. How do we get everyone to be able to see that horizon? And it made me go a step back again and going, right, you know, how do we convince those senior leaders that it's important nowadays and advantageous that everyone does see that horizon? Before we talk about how we're going to do it, how do we actually convince those that are going to make it happen actually see that it is important? Because you've mentioned two things there that one, I'm sold on it. Secondly, you also said before there's that power and letting go of power. And obviously if I distribute that power throughout the organization, that feels like I'm therefore diluting my own power or losing my power. So again, I'm gonna come back to you as the CEO and go, you know what, this doesn't sound good.
Well,
Why would I want to do this?
I'm going to turn it on its head. Why are we putting people who need power into these positions?
Mm,
And that we know that sociopaths have an ability to sort of weasel their way to the top.
yeah.
Why aren't we stopping that happening? So they don't make great leaders. They don't have compassion.
Mm,
They don't have connected. All of these factors, the courage, connectedness, compassion, and curiosity. They don't have these qualities. So why are we allowing these people to get to the top? It's a question for today's leadership teams, and it's a question for HR too. You
mm,
isn't it your job to actually put people into these positions who can actually, but who actually, are able to create the environment where everybody can give it their best?
mm.
So what are you letting these people get to the top for?
And when you think that makes me think of nature versus nurture.
Mm.
So to what degree are we letting those types of people get to the top and manage organizations versus to what degree do you have to become that sort of person to get to the top,
Well,
and
yeah.
versus again you get to the top and you then evolve into one of those people naturally.
There is a certain amount of that, and there's some research that shows that the more that people are exposed to figures and data, the
Yeah.
less human they become, or less humane they become, and vice versa. So the more, yeah. So that there is some data there, but I think ultimately it comes down to the competency frameworks that we have.
Mhm.
You know, we have got so much HR bling, stuff that looks good, like 9-box grids and all that stuff, which are completely worthless and have no real value at all. But we're stuck with them, and we use these to identify who should get promoted in organizations.
Mm,
It's um, the lack of an evidence base for all of this stuff,
mm,
and the fact that this stuff gets in the way of dialogue rather than and in some research we did into systemic talent management some years ago, we identified that the critical factor was the conversations that take place, the conversation in the head of the individual, the conversation with their boss, the conversation between talent generally and in the organization and HR on the top and the leadership,
mhm,
and the conversations in the informal systems where most of the most interesting decision making takes place. Um,
mm.
These are this is where leadership comes out of the woodwork, but we stifle it through trying to create processes. And just as we started this conversation around process being, the wrong thing for coaching, overemphasis on process, is not helpful. We talk about HR analytics. I think there's a B missing it. They're bad analytics. It comes up with mediocre results.
Yeah. Yeah, quite often I find that, and again, with the best intent, that a lot of policies that maybe come out, they're almost providing a crutch for the bad leg, to support the bad leg. So we are actually getting back walking, but we're not actually solving the real issue, and it's probably only going to get worse again.
Yeah, and your sociopath will steal the crutch anyway.
I love that. I think again, what you made me think of there is this differences again of leaders and leadership.
Yeah.
Because I think, whilst it's well documented and researched that we need to step away from this idea that it's the greatest and best performers that then step into that leadership role. I guess quite often that 9-box grid, that high performance, high potential grid that you mentioned, that still tends to promote in that way. And I remember having a wonderful conversation a couple of years ago on the podcast about the army, and talking about simultaneously teaching people to do their jobs, but also what it means to be a leader and a follower in this organization. And then you, in parallel, carry on learning that as you go along, as you perform well in your team. And then what kind of happens is you start to see the people who are natural leaders, and that's almost documented as much as the individual performers are. Now, do you tend to see, have you seen that happening well in any organizations where we look at leadership of those performers and we select better leaders to promote?
Well, I'm going to answer that from the side.
Okay.
There's a lovely desk study that looked at the Peter Principle in action. And what it did was to look at what happened if you promoted the best performer from each team to then go up into the next level of management.
Yeah.
So you promote on their performance rather than their ability to actually do that next level role. And what it concluded was that actually you'd get a marginally better result if you just chose somebody at random. So finding organizations that do this really well, it's hard. They tend to be smaller companies. Because the bigger the company gets, the more the bureaucracy it attracts. And one of the things I've been focusing on quite a bit in recent years is organizational arthritis, and how do you prevent that?
And making a note of that one as well.
Yeah. The idea that you can actually predict whether somebody is going to be effective in the next role without actually putting them in that role is just been disproven time and time again. Daniel Kahneman, the Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow, did his original experiments, assessment centers in the Israeli army. And they put people through these series of exercises, and people demonstrated leadership. So they said, right, these are supposed to be the leaders. And then they went out into the field and they weren't. Other people were more effective leaders because they weren't actually under stress, in the similar, all sorts of factors. But basically, you can only really measure whether somebody can do something in that next role if you put them in that role or a similar role. So we need to do far more in organizations of giving people projects. Projects where they've got to work with other people, projects where they've got to get things done without any authority. All these things. So helping them to demonstrate they have leadership skills by putting them in leadership situations. And projects are a very relatively cheap way of doing that. You put somebody in charge of a team that's a critical team, and they bomb. That costs a lot to the organization.
Yeah. you make him. It's really interesting again. So when you said before that in smaller organizations, you tend to see this happening well. And then I go back to something we talked about earlier on, which is this kind of visibility that the senior leaders have within the organization. And, which has then led to this need for reverse mentoring. Um, I guess, if you're all in the same room and there's 40 of you, you can see the people every day. You can see the whole team. You can see everyone, how they react to pressure, react to stress, who tends to step up, who tends to lead, who tends to put the head down and get the work done, all that sort of stuff. Whereas I guess, some of the people who will make those promotion decisions and high potential charts, quite often they don't, and I'm speaking from experience here of being involved in some of those conversations. There are voices having an opinion about people who very rarely, if ever, see them in the flow of work. They just see the results of some of their work.
And the biggest factor as to whether you perceive somebody to have leadership potential is how like you think they are.
That's kind of similarity bias going on. Do I see them myself in them?
Yeah.
Which again, based on what we just talked about before, that the people that may tend to go up the chain.
Yeah. Well, I see this is flattery bias as well. So your sociopath, coming back to them again, will know how to flatter you and make you feel good. But by basically buttering it up to you, making you feel that you're competent. Therefore, if they can see all how competent and clever you are, they must be clever too.
Got you. Yeah, that makes sense. So I'm starting to feel like I'm almost I can feel that the HR leaders that are listening to this episode, they're starting to shake a little bit, because I'm starting to get this idea that one of the things we need to do is get rid of these high performance frameworks. They don't really work. And also these performance reviews and appraisal systems, these don't work. And then they're starting to go, oh, this is feeling uncomfortable now, next thing I won't be needed. What's the first step?
The first step is to say, look, a lot of this has been a learning curve. Why do we have old-fashioned performance appraisals? Because nobody was doing any and having any conversations with their staff about how well they were performing. So you've got to put something in place. But now, okay, but that was years ago. Now let's be more intelligent about it. So what can we take from these processes that we know will work and create the kind of organization we want, and what do we have to abandon? We've talked about the 9 box grid. It's a good example. So as it's usually used, it's pretty useless. It doesn't do what it's supposed to. It's actually the most efficient way to get your staff to leave you, because people who don't feel if people get to know where they're perceived. There's somebody in the bottom left-hand corner. They'll be at the headhunter in no time. Yeah. But somebody in the top right-hand corner, if they don't get promoted within a couple of weeks, they're also at the headhunter saying, "Well, no, I can see it here, so I'm ready for something else." And you've lost. It's a negative engine. However, if you say to the individual, "Look, we're not making any judgments about you. We know people hate to be judged, but we'd like you to go out and talk to your stakeholders about how they see you." Where they see you having potential, where they see you contributing, etc., etc. And then you come back and based upon what you've heard, you provide your plan. We're back to the bow teams in a way. But you look at this and you analyze that data and say, well, this is what I'd like to do with that. So you push it. You push it back to the individual. Now, again, you're going to get people who are not capable of doing that, who basically don't really want to work, or who have other kinds of blockers to be able to take accountability. So people who are outer directed rather than inner directed, for example, will struggle more. But what you're doing is you're reducing the burden on HR, because you haven't got to administer all this rubbish every 6 months or a year. you're making life, reducing the burden on the leaders, the team leaders, and so forth. And you're giving the people in the organization more control over this thing.
Mm.
Um, and most of them are going to be pretty honest and quite accurate. In fact, what the data from some organization in Finland I visited, people tend to be much more honest and critical of themselves if you give themselves, they give them responsibility of that.
Mm.
So there's no need for them to be defensive. So
Yeah.
I think it's looking at it and saying, okay, what's the intelligent way
Mm.
to use to adapt these things that we have?
Mm.
I mean, in that original study of talent, one of the things we found was that, for example, having a corporate program where you send people automatically off to INSEAD or Harvard or something like that to a business school, and actually, the young talented organization didn't want that at all.
Mm.
They saw this as formulaic. They wanted to have things which were much more personalized for their own development because they are developing as individuals.
Mm.
Want to be seen as a number, as a cog in a machine.
Yeah. And I guess, in that world where I've seen it as well, when you're going into HR and the natural thing is, right, we're going to put you on the CIPD qualification. That's exactly what you have to do. Now, I'm not going to say anything bad about the CIPD qualification, but there is that, again, there's that systematic approach to go, well, that's what you have to do. Instead of something more individual in there to kind of go, you know what, the reason I'm in HR is because I want to progress. I want to manage HR and I want to do this. Great. The reason I'm in HR is because I love working with people and I like having these conversations and want to support. Oh, interesting. Which way does that go? And what is interesting me, I'm kind of distilling down in my mind what you've been talking about there. There is almost a piece around HR just actually doing themselves what they are wanting to create and being vulnerable,
Yeah.
letting some of their own control and power go, devolving and distributing that around the organization a little bit. Be prepared to use some of their time to just listen, watch, have conversations without the panic of having to look busy all the time and have busyness all the time, to actually set that culture in motion. Does that resonate?
Well, the biggest vulnerability of all is to go out to your stakeholders in the organization and ask them the question, what is it that we do that actually adds value to you?
Mm. Yeah. And what sort of answers do you tend to hear for that one?
Well, occasionally you get people say not very much, but I think, but that's not actually the most frequent reaction. First, the reaction is surprise. They ask the
Mm-hmm.
question in the first place, but then engagement.
Mm.
And say, well, where it's really helped me has been this, and this. But I really find filling in all these forms and those forms a real pain in the neck because it diverts me from having conversations with my staff when they really need it.
Yeah.
For example, so you're beginning to get the contrast, and you can build on the things that where they feel you are adding value. Um, uh, it's not that different from being a coach again.
Yeah. Yeah. It's coming through pretty much in every part of the conversation that we've been having today, that those skills are the same, that enable that power and to be distributed and enable that responsibility to grow inside people, to take ownership of the things themselves. Completely agree with you. I mean, I would one of the things I've seen a lot recently is this talk of marketing ourselves better, whether that's L&D or that's HR. And that really came to mind when you said, what value do I bring? What value do I add to you? I step back a little bit. There's a little shiver goes down my spine sometimes, that whilst I get the principle of why we need to market what we do more, I go, one of the maybe cynical views on marketing is it's trying to get people to buy what they don't want.
Yeah.
And if fundamentally they don't want it, when that business decision somewhere at some point in the past was made to go, we need a HR team and we need leadership development and we need coaching and we need an L&D team, that was made by someone somewhere as a business decision, not as a nice to have, but as a method of helping the business perform even better. and be a nicer place to work. So why, with those decisions having been made, are we now finding ourselves having to market it to try and sell it to the rest of the organization? The example I use is, IT and the finance team, the payroll team especially, they don't have to market themselves very well. Everyone knows.
I'm laughing here because one of the books that we produced nearly 40 years ago now was called Marketing the HR Function.
Yeah.
And I used to run courses for HR directors for CIPD around that whole area. But it all comes down to politics. And we recently produced a book last year, last year, called Coaching, Mentoring, and Organizational Politics. And what we were looking at there was, how do you remain authentic in a politicized environment? Every decision, who gets promoted, where you invest money, everything, they're all political decisions. And maintaining that authenticity is critical. And it's a skill. I run a course for the CIPD nowadays called for aspiring HR directors. So it's a mentoring program where aspiring HR directors are linked with existing HR directors. And it's brilliant for them, the feedback we get, the support they get around thinking through that very difficult transition. But politics keeps coming up in that one. How do I work with politics? So we developed a questionnaire to help people think about how their own perceptions of politics, how they engage with it. There's a book from South Africa, a lovely little book, that says, if you don't do politics, politics will do you.
Yeah.
And what the questionnaire does is to help you gauge where are you on the scale from politically naive to manipulative. And we need to be in the middle here. We need political savvy, or to be politically astute.
Yeah.
And that's a core skill for HR. Particularly when it gets towards the higher levels of the function and onto the board. The study I did for 2 or 3 years ago now, for CIPD and for RE, the Australian Human Resources Institute, we asked HR directors a simple question: what is it that you know now you wish you'd known before you become an HRD?
Yeah.
And apart from the guy who said, well, don't do it, they came out
run.
A lot of the messages were around, don't expect to be welcomed. Don't that your colleagues on the board will see that you automatically deserve a place there, that you ought to be seen as an equal. You've got to prove yourself.
Yeah.
We don't prove ourselves by being process driven. We prove ourselves by being able to influence.
Yeah. And what's one of the core things? I'm kind of bringing it right back to the start of our conversation now, because we've kind of stumbled back to the HR director at the table, and trying to talk about why things like coaching are so important in the organization, and not making it as process driven, please, so we can have that conversation. If we were to give a top tip or a top couple of tips to those HR directors on how to influence, therefore, whilst there, what would that be?
Focus on enabling the conversations to happen that need to happen. I mean, that's what coaching is about. It's enabling people to have the conversations they need to have with themselves and with other people. That's the core of it. So what are the conversations that need to happen in this organization? We've got a process, a product now, in fact, which we experimented with some years ago, and now we've revised, which I just find fascinating. It's basically a series of modules, very simple modules within a team. And so the team leader gets these and distributes it to everybody in the team, and each module focuses on a different aspect of coaching. So, why should we have a coaching culture in this team? What's the point? Yeah. How do we improve our ability to listen to each other and to our stakeholders, etc. And the team discusses these modules, the reading material and the little video and the thing that goes with them, and they discuss these after or before one of their normal team meetings. So it's just part of their normal routine. They don't have to go on a course or anything like that. But I said, well, how do we apply this knowledge? And it's a simple drip feed way of allowing the team to take responsibility for it developing its own coaching culture instead of trying to do it to you. And the lesson that we've taken from all this work is we need to stop pushing things down on people, and we need to be able to help people, give people the wherewithal to take accountability and responsibility themselves. And that doesn't matter whether it's team leaders in empowering their team to take greater accountability and responsibility, or whether it's HR doing this, or whether it's the board and the chief executive. The same message comes through.
I love that. I love that. It makes me think of something I say quite often, and that is that, you know, we've made this rod for our own back that we think people hate change. They don't. People actually love change. They talk about it every single day, what they want to change. What they don't like is change being done to them and not being involved in it. So I think there's some great advice there, and I'd love to hear just how this is falling in with those HRDs that are listening to this podcast.
Yeah, well, there's a little acronym that we have, which I think perhaps is a good way of summarizing this for leaders, coaches, for HR and whoever, and it's GOTBW.
GOT
BW.
BW. Yeah.
Get out of the bloody way.
Right, that's another title possibility. I love that. I think that's a fantastic bullet point to end that conversation. I absolutely love that conversation. It's been a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you so much for coming on to the show. If people, and I'm sure that lots of the people who are listening to this are already following you, but if they're not perchance, what's the best ways to keep following you and seeing what you're up to?
Right. Well, there's two ways, two obvious ways. That's so on LinkedIn, there are two sources. So you can find me, David Clutterbuck, on LinkedIn, or you can find my my company, my organization, which is Clutterbuck-CMI. .com. And so that's, you can both, but there's two sites there. But just go on to the website. And sign up to receive the blogs. We do at least one blog every 2 weeks. We try and be as challenging as we can on these, so it's provocative, and have a lot of fun doing it as well. So yeah, and just I'm one of the great things that I find is just being available, you know, we get so many interesting ideas from HR people with questions about what do we do about this? Yeah. Then it stimulates research, for example. So I'm certainly not aloof.
Brilliant, absolutely brilliant. So again, encouraging conversations leads to more research, which leads to more answers, and love it. For those listening, I will make sure I'll put those two links to those resources, to your LinkedIn and also the website. I'll put that in the notes for the show so people can get there nice and easily. Which brings us on to our last little task, David, which is the title for the episode.
Oh,
the title for the episode. Now, based on what we've been talking about, has anything kind of shone out in your mind?
So I'm giggling here because of a conversation just a couple of days ago about pronouns. You know, should I, he, him, she, her, so forth. And my comment back was, I don't wish to be identified, but for gender to be my identifying factor. I don't think it's particularly relevant to anything. Now, age is another matter. I do find that age discrimination is an interesting area, or neurodiversity even. But if we stick with age, I want to have the acronym NDY.
NDY.
Not dead yet. And maybe that's the.
I'm loving that. I was like, well, I had written down things like HR bling, I had organisational arthritis. Get out of the bloody way. But I think not dead yet might have just top trumped all of them. Is that what we should call this episode then?
If you like, yeah, I'm very happy. Yes,
we will do that. Absolute pleasure. Thank you so much again for coming on the show. I've really enjoyed the conversation. Very grateful to you.
Okay.
I'll speak to you again.
Bye.
Well, that's it for another episode of the Leadership Untitled podcast. Thanks for listening. And this episode will be called NDY, rather funnily, Not Dead Yet. My thanks again go out to Professor David Clutterbuck and all of you for listening or watching on YouTube. Until next time, see you soon.